Chapter 19. Repentance. As the day of her trial was slowly approaching, Paxsura began to meditate on her role as a catechumen, as self-condemning thoughts began to arise inside her, telling her to return to her old ways, and that she was irredeemable. The thoughts then began to torment her within her prayers, though through persistence they eventually subsided. And for once in her life, despite her stubborn nature, she felt weak, having never had such dark thoughts before, unsure if they were really from herself or something else. So she asked Father Seraphim, "Why am I having these unholy thoughts when I'm trying to pray or do anything good? I have never experienced this before, even during my days as a Vertok idolater. I have thoughts that tell me to commit sacrilege and to see others as less than people. I don't want these because they remind me of my past life which I am trying to leave behind." Father Seraphim then answered, "These thoughts you are experiencing are nothing to be worried about, because that is all they are. They are merely suggestions that have no real power outside yourself, when you choose not to act upon them. But rather let us ignore them, because until we entertain them they have no power over us. I have heard many similar confessions, even from a very pious Orthodox Christian who thought he was a heretic because he was having thoughts that were not in line with the Orthodox Church, even though he rejected them as soon as he came to know God more clearly. Rather, we ought to meditate in prayer and holy thoughts to drive away these logus moi, that we may through God's grace and synergy with our perseverance be free from them." Paxsura then looked relieved. "At least now I know I am not the only one who has them." Father Seraphim then looked at Paxsura with reassurance. "Everyone, including the greatest of saints, has faced them, and through reading their lives we follow their example and overcome them. These temptations are not uncommon for people who have anywhere at any time throughout the history of the Church. Is there anything else you wish to know from me?" "I also have another question. I'm trying to do the right thing, but I am torn as to whether or not I should turn in my own family, exposing everything they have done to this queendom, which will in all likelihood start a civil war. Or I can be silent, sparing a civil war, but have the guilt of knowing their abuses to continue. And as of now, I only told my brother, who changed his name to Giovanni, and my daughter Ariana about it. I'm not sure what the right answer is, and, if able, what can you tell me about what I should do? As an ordained priest, I am not to take part in political partisanship. But one thing is certain. As Orthodox Christians, we should do what is for the common good, and choosing the greater good is hardly ends in any good at all. So, the better question is, what serves the common good for both your family and the people of this queendom? What decision will bring the most good for both your family and your people?" Paxsura then sat in silence before hesitantly saying, "I'm afraid to answer that question, because of how political it may sound, but it would be to strip most of my family of their political power and royal titles and have them replaced with people who will serve the common good. Yet I fear without a fair trial for them and how I have little power to influence these things, beyond asking my daughter or Ambiel for something about it, and to fill them in on all the details. From my limited perspective, it appears all I can do is tell them and trust that they will do the right thing." "Then do what you are able and trust that God in His divine wisdom and mercy will fulfill the rest for the common good. After all, we cannot expect to be able to do everything by ourselves as created beings, because without God we can do nothing. We are also not meant to do everything or go through life alone, and it was through my many confessions I have heard from fellow sinners that I have seen how loneliness can destroy so many people. It is what causes me guilt whenever I am prideful to remember that the many people God has given me to minister to, and that many of them are much less sinful than I, and I become a Pharisee. And it was part of overcoming my own pride that I chose to minister unto you, when my bishop asked for volunteers to minister unto you in response to your request of becoming a catechumen. Although we may have come from many different backgrounds, like you, I was also a Vertok practitioner, and hated the church and defaced many churches with spray paint, and throwing bricks through stained glass windows." Paxsura then looked like her former hatred of the church was somewhat relatable and asked, "What happened then, if you don't mind me asking?" "I was arrested and brought up on vandalism charges. But despite what I had done, it was the local bishop that stepped in and convinced the judge to lower my sentence to community service. And it was at this moment I learned what it meant to forgive and love one's enemies. But as a Eucharistic people, we are called to be grateful to God and merciful to others, because God is so merciful to us. And it was during this community service, removing spray paint from the local churches I vandalized, that I got to meet the people I hated in person, yet almost none of them hated me back. Then I realized how much of my young and rebellious self was lied to, and I think those who justly hated me back were lied to about us Veritas practitioners also. Paxsura then started to reminisce about something. It's almost like me and Edentio. Though I persecuted her church, somehow she found it within herself to still treat me like someone who was worth loving. And I think it's the first time I ever felt real love before. Not in a romantic way, though. The only thing is, I wish she was Orthodox instead of Catholic. Father Seraphim then thought he should mention something and said, though we may not be in communion with the Bishop of Rome and know where the church is, we cannot say we know where the church is not. And for all we know, this Edenthiel was most likely a manifestation of God's love towards you, in a way that you would understand. God can do whatever God wants, and I doubt God is going to condemn any Catholics or even Protestants in severe error for doing the best of their ability to love God and grow in virtue and charity. And it is not our place to judge the salvation of others, because that is only for God to decide. Plus there was also a saying from Jesus to his apostles about a certain person, who although was not one of them, was casting out demons and doing good works in Jesus' name. So Jesus told his apostles not to forbid this person from doing so. And just because someone is not within the canonical boundaries of the Orthodox Church does not mean they cannot be channels of God's grace. And based on that, I really do think Edenthe was a channel of God's grace. I really wonder if I would have even become a catechumen if it wasn't for her. And even though she didn't seem to believe in herself, maybe she didn't need to, and maybe she was sent to Versifeth for a similar reason. Edenthiel and Versifeth. Edenthiel and Versifeth were trotting on horses through the horse trails of Lansara woods. As Versifeth said, Mrs. Edenthiel, I am pleased that you would speak to me yourself about your concerns rather than the servants. And for that I commend you. Now what is it that you wanted to speak to me about? Edenthiel then answered, It's about my husband Jeremiah, and the servants told me you were going to kill him. Is this true? Versifeth then remained silent for a moment before answering. Edenthiel, I should be honest here, though I know how much you love Jeremiah, but because of him, my family name is on the line. I cannot allow my family's killer to run free, and Kigoi Umbriel has denied me justice for my family. I'm sure someone as empathetic as yourself would understand what it must be like to be denied justice for your family, by those who swore to uphold it. It is why I fear I must take justice into my own hands for their sake, because if I don't, no one else will. And unless Queen Paxsura, a part of that impostor, tells me otherwise, I will continue to restore my family's honor. I will not allow this injustice to be a weak link in the chain of a mighty dynasty. Edenthe then looked in despair, but seeing this Versifeth felt mercy in her heart, and said, But knowing you, and how much grief it would cause you, perhaps we can reach a compromise. Perhaps rather than kill Jeremiah, I will force him into life in prison or be a family slave. Perhaps that way I can have my justice and you will not have to see your husband die. Edenthe then responded, So long as my husband is spared, I don't care what happens to me. Versifeth then looked at Edenthiel with curiosity and pity. Edenthiel, you would truly lay your life down for him? Why would you do this for him when you are so much better than him? I love him more than I love myself. Versifeth then asked, I see. Why then are you making things so emotionally difficult for me? I am trying to save his life now that we're trying to get justice for my family's name. And not only now do I regret hiring a bounty hunter to capture you, now that your presence makes me wish I didn't feel the way I currently am. And now I'm considering confessing it was all my idea. If any one of my relatives are accused, so they don't have to suffer for what is ultimately my doing. He then blankly stares into Versifeth's abnormally pale face and silver eyes. Then it seems the love we have for our family is something we share. Yet I'm afraid that even if you do spare his life, his sister Ariana will probably send the royal guard after you anyway. And for as much as the love magic I've been given belongs to the most powerful of all magical elements, I can't influence her heart by my own will, and to do my will instead of hers. Versifeth then put his finger on her mouth like a philosopher and asked, "Love magic? I've never heard that before. But if you could change her heart, what would you do instead of her?" "First, I would want to know why you did it. And wouldn't be surprised if Paxsura already told her what you did from the letters you probably sent her. Because even though Paxsura was heavily misguided, she still loves her daughter. And if Queen Ariana does send the royal guard after you, I pray the Lord has mercy on you if Umbriel discovers it, and is the one who will send after you." "I would also pray Umbriel has mercy on me, although I doubt he would, because he's a Christian traitor given his allegiance to the god of the Zolshurans instead of our pantheon. But as to why the god of the Zolshurans would claim you for his own is beyond my understanding. Has he told you why he double predestined someone as good as yourself along with those deplorable Zolshurans for himself and condemned us Selenes?" "Huh? Double predestination? What are you talking about?" "I've read great Christian theologians such as Apollonius and Corvin Severil. And having read through Corvin, I think it describes well what you Christians believe. Total depravity, double predestination, limited atonement, irresistible grace and perseverance of the saints, which describes well how your kind treat us as Selenes, as predestined for damnation and therefore disposable. And Apollonius describes it well in his teaching, that the only thing that matters is intellectual assent to secret knowledge, with no real works as evidenced by your kind's lack of care towards any good works, and rejection of the physical action as having any salvific value or truth to be found." Versifeth, that doesn't even sound remotely Christian, but like pure Manichaean and Gnostic heresy." "Then if that is true, why is it that the people of the Christian province of Caroline widely believe Corvin and Apollonius' theology if they are not true?" "Are the people of Caroline mostly composed of Gnostics and Manichaeans?" "I do not know, because I do not know what Gnostics and Manichaeans are. Enlighten me and I will be able to give you an answer based on what you define them as." "Well, the Gnostics were a group of heretics in the 1st and 2nd century of the Church that rejected all physical matter as evil. Believed they had secret knowledge, believed in salvation through intellectual assent to a set of ideas, also referred to as gnosis, believed in double predestination, believed the body was a prison for the soul, and oftentimes went down either a path of extreme hedonism or extreme asceticism to destroy the body. The Manichaeans are similar, can be summed up as philosophy of dualism. So, in more simplified terms, Manichaeans can be summed up as dualistic political propaganda that disgusts me. And Gnosticism is basically ancient Zolshuran philosophical nonsense. So I guess the people of Caroline really are Manichaeans in their democratic propaganda, and Gnostic heretics in how they live their supposedly Christian lives. I'm not really familiar with Selenes politics, sorry. That's probably a good thing. I've seen both the snooze fest or things so comically dumb that not even the most absurdest comedy could compare to it. Besides, your commoner, other than my chief servant, had that I have a pleasant time with in a long time. Others have been far too terrified of me, or just hail insults, which I promptly punish them for. Then there's the Christians in Caroline, which you now tell me are a bunch of Zolshuran Gnostics and Manichaeans. The worst plague on a good Vertok society. And their Manichaeanism makes them ripe for the inferior system of democracy. Seriously, who could possibly think a system built conning the largest bloc to vote for you in popularity contest is any good way to govern anything besides an ancient Zolshuran philosopher that has a little too much wine? Tell me, do you Christians really support such a terrible system, giving me more reason not to be one?" Gentile then looked a little confused. "Well, we don't really have a preferred political system because our kingdom is not of this world. The only political system a Christian can be in favor of is communism, because communism is rooted in atheism and condemned as a heresy. I honestly cannot fathom how anyone could think communism was a good idea. Even when imposed upon us and at its highest levels of indoctrination, we still could not accept it, and it collapsed in on itself even without the Zolschuan effort, and left us all in a worse state than when we started. And I am grateful Paxsura was the queen we needed her to be, to pull us out of the ashes of communism and restore our culture which had been destroyed, and broke the Zolschuan chains that forced us to be a people that we were not. To the Christians and Manichaean Gnostics in the south, such as Caroline, the Nymphs, and Elven Euphrasia, she is a terror and a persecutor. But to us who have had to live through communism and the destruction of our identity, unlike them who did not suffer, Paxsura is a savior. This is why many still support Paxsura as the true queen and not her apostate daughter Ariana, who will in all likelihood under the influence of Christianity force us all to be Zolschuan. And it's part of the reason many of us nobility in the Zlunsora royal family want to reinstate Paxsura as opposed to her daughter, and remove her by force if necessary, and bring her assailant Jeremiah to justice, that Umbriel denied us. But considering Jeremiah did not kill Paxsura, I will not sentence him to death, but rather either to life imprisonment or slavery, which is low considering attempted murder on a member of the royal family is a capital offence. And that's not counting the nobility he murdered on the day of that impostor's coronation, which will be left up to the discretion of those above this earthly existence. And after having heard Versifer's side of the events, she remained silent, but in silence, hopeful. Catechumen continued. As Paxsura and Father Seraphim were conversing with each other, Paxsura asked, I understand I must learn and live the faith before becoming a member of the Church, but I am not sure if I will be convicted or live. Regardless, I want to be baptized and chrismated into the Church, but I will accept my fate if I am denied. Father Seraphim then answered, It is normal in the Celanese Orthodox Church for a catechumenate process to take 3 years for those leaving the Veritak religion. But because you have been learning so quickly and have not been distracted with worldly affairs, I will ask my bishop permission to have your catechumen to be completed sooner. Thank you. I have also come to realization that I will not be needing these assets if I am convicted. So if you know anyone who needs my financial, legal, or some other support that I can give, let me know. And if anyone asks, just say you don't know where the support came from. I'm not interested in glory, let alone my life is quite infamous, and I don't want my name to be a stumbling block for them. I can understand that, especially given that glory and pride are universal temptations. After all, my former servants are going to need something to do and a place to stay after all this, and learning from the washing of the feet of the disciples. As a true leader to my servants, I must begin by serving them, and in their case, allow them to use their skills for the common good. I only wish I had learned sooner, and I am grateful to the Lord that has answered my prayers to lead my daughter Ariana into the queen my people need her to be. And I do not envy that she is better the person than me. You remind me of how things might have been different if Emperor Nero had repented. And even if you don't see any good in yourself, your actions can be responsible for the restoration of this queendom unto God. And even though Father Seraphim was unaware of prophesying over Paxsura, it reminded her of the good Edenthiel still saw in her, and for a brief moment she felt at peace. Did you know this? Why Edenthiel mistook Celanese Protestantism for ancient heresies? Because Edenthiel's home country of the Fey Kingdom was separated from humanity in the 1300s, the only Christianity she knows about is Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, because of the Great Schism of 1054 predating the Fey Kingdom. She was also well catechized throughout her education, hence learning all the major heresies condemned by the Nicene-Constantinople Creed, accepted by both Catholics and Eastern Orthodox without the Filioque clause. And 2 of those heresies condemned by the Creed were Gnosticism and Manichaeanism. Hence, Edenthiel's first event described Celanese Protestantism, i.e. Corvinism and Apollonianism, to Denthiel, it sounded like she was describing Manichaeism and Gnosticism to her, with how similar they sound. However, lore-wise, most Protestants don't even consider Corvinists and Apolloniosites even Christians, because of how many Gnostic elements both groups have, as well as removed entire books from the New Testament, being the Gospel of John, James, and the Epistles of John, and Revelation. And the reason I refer to the neo-Gnostics within the Ceylonese Protestants is because it started out as a movement, as a protest against abuse and corruption of the Zaltschern Church, until it was eventually hijacked by a few radicals, leading to mostly uneducated and poorly catechized population towards their innovations, chiefly being Corvin Several, who was deposed from teaching theology at the University of Elva-New-Phæsia, for refusing reproof, and the Apollonius, who was anathematized priest for knowingly preaching heresy, after being corrected on many occasions. And the primary appeal of Corvin and Apollonius' heresies to the mostly uneducated population was that it offered a feeling of eternal security, and a simple solution to something that was a much more complex issue of corruption within the church hierarchy. Heresy of double predestination. Often associated with John Calvin and Calvinism, the doctrine of double predestination does not originate with Calvin. It actually originates with the Gnostics back in the 1st and 2nd century, as attested to in the work of St. Irenaeus of Lyons in his writings titled Against Heresies, where his specific doctrine is condemned as a heresy. Hence, because the doctrine of double predestination is essential for Calvinism, Calvinism is officially condemned as a heresy, both by Catholics and Eastern Orthodox in opposing the heresy of Gnosticism, in which came 1400 years earlier. It is also condemned as a heresy by many Protestants who do not subscribe to John Calvin's theology under the authority of the Scriptures, that God is not the author of sin, and double predestination would make God the author of sin. Logismoi. The logismoi are a type of assaulting thoughts that mimic one's own thoughts, but are not actual someone's thoughts. They are the first step in Orthodox understanding of how demons tempt people to sin and are not sins of themselves. Some Veritas dogmas. Although the Veritas is a made-up religion for the purpose of fleshing out the Ceylonese culture, there are actually a couple of dogmas that influence Versifeth's thinking. One of those dogmas is actually quite anomalous for pagan religion and is belief in objective morality, and that there's such a thing as absolute truth. Hence, Versifeth absolutely cannot accept neo-Gnosticism of the Corvinists and the Apolloniosites, in which she mistook for authentic Christianity. The Veritas religion also does not believe the pantheon are the only gods that exist, hence the Veritas practitioners have shrines to Inari of the Kitsune clan, which are not part of the Veritas pantheon. Hence Versifeth doesn't deny Jesus exists, but rather believes he is not relevant to her life or that he is aversive to her. There's also the dogma of the Veritas religion that says that the royal families are semi-divine or have divine ancestry, while the common folk don't and therefore have the right to rule over them, and do as they please to a certain extent. Hence Christianity not only threatens theologically to the Ceylonese royal family, but also politically, hence Versifeth seeing Christians more as a political enemies than personal enemies. And with neo-Gnostics having a dead faith without any good works, Versifeth basically considers them practically atheists, and therefore associates them with its reign of terror under the atheistic communist regime that preceded Paxsura's reign. Historical accuracy. When Father Seraphim mentions that the catechumenate process typically takes 3 years for someone coming out of the Veritas pagan religion, this is actually historically accurate. The catechumenate process historically took 3 to 4 years before the catechumen was baptized into the church, when most converts were from pagan backgrounds with no knowledge of Christian life. However, in recent times in the United States, where catechumens are either of a Protestant or a Catholic background, it's rare the catechumenate process takes more than a year.